These are some of the most pressing issues of our time, especially the explosion of billionaire wealth has been one of the most dramatic evolution of the world economy of the last decades. It started in the 1980s, it accelerated after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and now there's an acceleration of the acceleration. And a lot, frankly, of what's happening in our democracies is downstream of this explosion of billionaire influence. Taxation of the very rich, the boom in extreme wealth, which are some of the most important, frankly, issues of our time. Not only of corruption, but the total, oligarchic capture of the capital.
Those are enormous claims. Zucman isn't merely arguing for a new tax. He's arguing that extreme wealth is one of the defining political problems of our age. So there are really 5 questions. 1. Is the system unfair? 2. Is inequality causing the harms claimed? 3. Are institutions actually being captured? 4. Can people simply leave? And 5. Even if the policy works, what does it achieve?
The principle is that if you are extremely wealthy, and we can debate what it means, but I've proposed owning more than $100 million in wealth. If you're extremely wealthy, you have to pay an unavoidable minimum amount of tax each and every year.
This is where the argument changes gears. Up to this point, we've been talking about a perceived flaw in the tax system. Now we're talking about a very specific remedy. And spotting a problem is one thing. Demonstrating that your preferred solution actually works is another.
Okay, so, it's trivial. You might say, well, surely this must be already somewhere in our laws, except it's not.
Yeah.
So we need to create this principle that, you can't pay zero. And today, some of those billionaires, they pay zero.
Yeah.
Like, you had revelations a few years ago by the US media, ProPublica, on the taxes paid by US billionaires.
Yeah.
And you saw people like Elon Musk, Jeff
paying
Bezos,
zero tax.
paying zero tax.
Yeah.
There's even
The
1 year,
people in the world.
Jeff Bezos receives a check, a tax credit for his children.
Yeah.
So that's just wrong.
Yeah.
Everybody agrees with that.
Notice the move. Most people probably do think there's something odd about a billionaire reporting zero taxable income. But agreement that a problem exists isn't agreement about how to solve it. That's the question we're going to have to keep testing throughout this discussion.
Okay. So there has to be a floor. So first of all, the floor. So that everybody understands the proposal. There has to be a minimum. Now,
and this is on the basis that at the moment these people are paying less in percentage terms than cleaners and taxi drivers and hairdressers and teachers.
Yeah. So there has to be a minimum. Then, for the minimum to be effective, it has to be expressed not as a fraction of income.
Okay.
Because the whole problem is that those billionaires,
because they have no income.
They manage to report no income, like Jeff Bezos, right?
Yeah. So in a technical sense, of course, in a real sense, they have income.
From the perspective of the tax law.
Yeah.
Okay. To be fair to Zucman, this mechanism is real. If your wealth sits in appreciating assets, you can borrow against them rather than sell them. The tax system sees debt. Your lifestyle sees spending power. That's the gap he's trying to close.
They manage to pretend
they're
that they don't have
redefining their income.
Like as CEO of Amazon, Jeff Bezos didn't pay himself a wage.
Yeah.
As controlling shareholder of Amazon, he instructed the company not to distribute dividends.
Yeah.
He didn't sell shares, and so he didn't realize capital gains, and so his taxable income was truly zero.
But of course,
there's no tax evasion
his company's making enormous profits, but none of them. And
again, this is a legal outcome, not tax evasion. Bezos doesn't take a wage, he doesn't take dividends, he doesn't sell shares. So taxable income can be very low or even zero. That's a real issue. The question is whether an annual wealth tax is the best answer.
He owns the company.
And he owns the company.
Essentially, all the money stays in this bucket. None of it comes to this bucket, so officially I have no income.
Exactly. So his true economic income is very large. It's in the billions. His wealth is gigantic, but he paid no income tax. And that's legal, and that's the way the system works. But of course, it's not a good way. It's not a good system. So we need to create a minimum.
Fair enough. But notice how much is being compressed here. Bezos' company has profits. Bezos owns shares. Those shares may rise in value. He may borrow against them. And his taxable income may still be zero. Those are related facts, but they are not the same thing. Company profits are already taxed at the company level. Share price gains are usually taxed when realized. Borrowing creates spending power, but not income. So yes, there is a real gap here. But once again, identifying the gap does not tell us which tax should fill it.
Look, wealth for most people, it's a good thing, right? For the middle class, it's owning a home, it's pensions for your old days, it's safety, in case shocks happen, you lose your job. It's great. We like to encourage wealth accumulation by the middle class. For the working class, they don't have access to property.
Yeah.
Not yet. The working class, the bottom 50% of the distribution, almost owns no wealth. Their debts are about as high as their assets. We like to encourage access, we like the working class to have access to wealth. Okay, so we want to encourage wealth accumulation in general. Now, for the super rich, wealth is not, not accumulating billions for their old days, right? For them, wealth is power.
Okay, hold on. We've moved from taxation to power. Wealth creates influence. Nobody serious denies that. The question is whether that influence becomes the democratic crisis being claimed.
It's the power to influence the prevailing ideology. It's the power to influence markets by buying competitors. It's the power to influence politics by buying elections, by influencing policy making. And there is always a fundamental tension in democratic societies between the concentration of wealth on the one hand, and extreme wealth in particular, and the very possibility of a democratic society. All the people who have written on democracy back to Aristotle, they've written about that.
Notice the escalation. We've moved from wealth creates influence to wealth threatens democracy itself. That's a much larger claim, and larger claims require larger evidence.
But that's exactly what's happening, right? Yeah. It's this kind of loop where wealth begets power, which begets more wealth.
Wealth creates influence. Nobody disputes that. The question is whether influence has become capture. Because if democratic institutions have already been captured by wealth, then it's unclear why those same institutions are supposed to implement and defend the solution.
It's this kind of loop where wealth begets power, which begets more wealth.
Here's the tension. If wealth has already captured the institutions, why are those same institutions the solution? The diagnosis and the cure seem to depend on opposite assumption.
Yes.
And look at what's happening in the US with, frankly, the plutocratic collapse
and you think
of the
that
federal government. Like just yesterday, like the government announced that Trump had signed a deal with the IRS, according to which he and his family would be shielded from any tax audit for the rest of their life.
Notice that the examples are now doing a different job. We're no longer discussing whether billionaires pay too little tax. We're discussing whether democratic institutions themselves are being captured. That's an important shift, because the larger the diagnosis becomes, the more demanding the evidence needs to be.
Because Trump, had sued the IRS because his tax return had been disclosed, and he was asking $10 billion from the agency that he controls as president. And they settled on, okay, let's make a deal. You're not going to have to pay me $10 billion, but from now on, you're forbidden from just auditing my tax returns or those of my children. Look, the degree, not only of corruption, but the total, oligarchy capture of the government. And you have to also realize how fast it can happen. Because sometimes people look at the US and they're like, whatever happens there cannot happen here. But no, first, it's a global trend. It can happen very fast. I've experienced it firsthand in France, the 2% minimum tax proposal, minimalistic. Everybody should be in favor. 86% of the population is in favor. And the billionaires, when it came very close to passing a few months ago, they used all the media that they own, and they own 85% of the private press.
And this is the same question again. These examples may establish influence. They do not automatically establish capture. And if capture really is as pervasive as described, then institutional reform would seem to be the first problem to solve, because every policy depends on those institutions.
The second crucial ingredient is how do you deal with the threat of migration. Rich people, always the debate boils down to, okay, perhaps it would be good to tax the super rich, but they're going to move. They're going to move to Dubai, to Monaco, and we can't do anything. This is wrong. You know,
Okay.
it's wrong that it's not wrong that they will move. Surely some of them will. You know, those flows tend to be exaggerated in the public debate, but it's not zero. But what is wrong is this idea that we are powerless to curb this tax exile. We are not powerless because any country on its own, let's take the UK, could say the following. It could say, look, if someone has lived for a long time in the UK,
Yeah.
number one, and number two has become extremely rich in the UK, and now number three moves to another country, that's their right, fine, but we, the UK, we will keep taxing that person as if he or she was still a resident of the UK for 5 years or 10 years.
Hold on. Economics is ultimately about incentives. Change the rules and people change their behaviour. The question isn't whether governments can tax wealth, it's whether people respond to the new incentives that creates.
We can discuss, okay? And any country on its own can do that, so that there would be no incentive anymore
Yeah.
for the super rich to move for tax reasons.
No incentive anymore? That's an extraordinary claim. Not less incentive, not weaker incentive, no incentive. But incentives are precisely what we're talking about. The entire argument depends on how people respond to changing rules, and history suggests they respond a great deal. The moment you create a new tax burden, people start looking for ways to reduce it, avoid it, restructure around it, or relocate from it. That's not a moral judgment, it's simply how incentives work. So before we conclude that a policy eliminates the incentive to move, we need to explain why, this time, human behaviour will suddenly stop responding to economic incentives in the way it always has.
And so then you might say, well, it's impossible, it's never been done. Well, no, that's what the US does. The US is even more extreme than that. The US says if you have US citizenship and you move to another country, you have to pay taxes to the US until you die.
And this is a fair point. Countries are not completely powerless. Governments can create exit taxes. Governments can create continuing tax obligations. Governments can make avoidance more difficult. So I don't think the serious objection is that enforcement is literally impossible. The question is whether these rules eliminate the behavioural responses that the policy itself creates. Because reducing an incentive is one thing, eliminating it is another.
Rory Stewart that he should read a bit more and listen a bit more to what's happening in the rest of the world, and he would realize very quickly that there is in fact overwhelming support, even among academic economists. Of course, in the general population, but more importantly, for your question, among economists for this proposal. Like, for instance, in July of 2025, there was an op-ed in Le Monde that was signed by 7 Nobel Prize winners.
Seven
Nobel Prize
winners.
winners.
Okay.
Who wrote,
Okay.
we support this, it was exactly about this proposal. And 2% minimum tax on the super rich, 2% of their wealth, and they supported France doing it on its own. Don't wait for an international agreement. Lead by example, do it. And they explain the logic, the failure of our tax system today to effectively tax the super rich, why that's the right approach to fixing that problem. 7 Nobel Prize winners, Joe Stiglitz, Paul Krugman, Esther Duflo, Darren Acemoglu, many others. Then in the debate in France, you had many economists who came out strongly in support. Like, for instance, the former chief economist of the IMF, Olivier Blanchard.
Fine. Let's assume every economist named here is right. Let's assume the policy is workable, avoidance is manageable, and the legal problems can be overcome. We still arrive at the question every tax proposal eventually has to answer. What does it actually achieve?
It will demonstrate that you can get a lot of revenue. For the UK, we're talking about £15 billion per year from just taxing at 2% the wealth of the super rich. And the sun is going to keep rising in the morning, okay? And then once one country does it, many countries very fast will start doing it. And that's how you create this international movement.
Okay.
So
It could be us.
I
It
count
could be
on
the
you.
UK.
It can be you, and often the UK has led.
And this is where I think we finally arrive at the question that matters most. Not whether serious economists support the proposal. Clearly many do. Not whether the proposal can be designed. The question is what the policy actually achieves. because eventually every fiscal argument runs into arithmetic, not morality, not fairness. Arithmetic. How much revenue are we talking about, and does it materially change the problems we're trying to solve?
For the UK, we're talking about £15 billion per year.
And £15 billion is not trivial. Any chancellor would happily take an extra £15 billion, but we also need a sense of scale. UK public spending is well over £1 trillion per year. So even if the policy works exactly as intended, even if avoidance is manageable, even if migration effects are limited, even if enforcement succeeds, we're still talking about a revenue source that is meaningful rather than transformative. It doesn't solve Britain's productivity problem. It doesn't solve stagnant growth. It doesn't solve the housing crisis.
These are some of the most pressing issues of our time.
It doesn't solve energy costs.
And now there's an acceleration of the acceleration.
It doesn't solve the fiscal pressures created by an aging population. At best, it provides some additional revenue to help fund government spending. And that's probably where I part company with Gary's framing of this issue. Listening to some of these discussions, you'd think taxing billionaires is the central economic challenge facing Britain.
I really think it's the main economic and political issue of our time. Hence, a lot of our work these days is about that.
Taxation
of the very rich,
yeah.
the boom in extreme wealth, which are some of the most important, frankly, issues of our time. Not only of corruption, but the total, oligarchy capture of the capital.
So where does that leave us? I think Zucman establishes a real fairness concern. The tax system can allow enormous wealth accumulation with very little taxable income. That's a genuine issue. Beyond that point, the case becomes less certain. The evidence for the wider social harms is mixed. The claims about institutional capture are larger than the evidence presented. The behavioural responses are treated too lightly. And even if everything works as advertised, the policy raises around £15 billion a year. Useful, certainly, but not transformative. We began with claims about the defining political crisis of our age and ended with a relatively modest revenue measure. Somewhere between those 2 points, I think there are still some unanswered questions. That's where I remain unconvinced. If you enjoyed this discussion, if you disagree with it, or if you think I've missed something important, let me know in the comments below. And if you'd like more long-form reactions to economics, politics, philosophy, and public policy, consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.